Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&A. I have to record these Thursday morning because I'm headed out to Jersey to hopefully be a guest on a friend of mine's YouTube channel doing something not even remotely related to retro gaming, and I hope it all works out. We tried this a month ago and there was like a big equipment failure and I didn't bring one of the things I was supposed to, so who knows, maybe I'm speaking too soon here, but hopefully I'll have a fun video to share with you next week that some of you would be interested in, but if you're here for retro gaming, you won't. I mean that with love and respect. But anyway, let's jump into the questions and see what we got. And hopefully I had enough time to allow everybody enough time to get their questions in for the week. First up, a reference from last week. Matt Richtenberg said they watched the Hyper Fighting Virtual Boy event stream and the bottom row of pixels is missing there as well. So this might just be the cost of doing business. So that's pretty interesting. I never noticed that, but if there's anybody out there that's a Virtual Boy or a Virtual Tap expert that might be able to explain what's going on there, I'd certainly be interested to know the answer just out of curiosity. It's my personal opinion that that would never bug me. It wouldn't be like, interference on the screen would kind of bug me a lot more than one missing row of pixels, but I'm a nerd. I'd love to know the answer to that. So hopefully we'll figure that out at some point, but thanks for taking the time to check out the stream and confirming that. So I made a mistake last week. Darkstar7 reminded me that I smushed up the Atari 5200 and 7800 Inquire Boys question. 5200 RGB boards and DVI via the Sofia mod are still available, but the 7800 mod is still work in progress, but Retro HQ James is working on that and getting closer. So thank you very much. That was my fault for not double checking myself on that, but you're 100% right, and I apologize for the mistake. It happens. I make at least one mistake each one of these Q&As, but they're usually much smaller things, like calling pi 3.41 instead of 3.14 or something like that. So thank you for the correction, and I apologize for that. Jake the Naked Snake wants to know, would a PS2 HDMI mod be able to force all games to run in progressive scan mode, or would it require a deinterlacer? I'm not sure at what stage of the process the image becomes interlaced. I'm assuming this is not something specifically on the disc and is due to hardware. So there's no easy answer to that, but I'm going to try to walk through it. First, an HDMI mod, I'm 99% sure, would have to deinterlace it. So while technically everything would be outputted in progressive scan, anything that was 480i would have hopefully motion adaptive deinterlacing applied to it, which would, it's not perfect. It's certainly not as good as native 480p, but it's certainly better than a lot of the other options for both lag and eyesight reasons. Now, forcing progressive mode is something that needs to be done in software because a lot of these games had to enable the ability to do so in software and then create the software to support it. And the best way to explain that would be to use something like the GSM, the mode selector, and force games into different aspect ratios or resolutions. Because if you mess around with that, sometimes it works pretty perfectly and sometimes it doesn't, and you see all kind of crazy stuff on the screen, which shows that the software itself was never meant to do that. So I think in a perfect world, and this is speculation and wishful thinking, this is not factual based here, so this is just something that I hope would be possible that may be completely impossible. But in a perfect world, you would have the ability to run a customized version of GSM along with the HDMI mod that would work, and maybe download a database and automatically force all compatible games to 480p or 16:9 480p. And once again, that's running in original aspect ratio, rendered in 480p, the 16:9, not stretching or anything like that. So that would be the perfect thing, once again, I have to repeat myself for anybody who's doing this on a commute and only half listening. This is a pipe dream. I don't know if this is possible, but a really great solution would be said HDMI mod connects wirelessly to a database, and every time you load up a game, it checks that database and says, yes, this is absolutely compatible with forcing 480p and or 16:9 modes. Let's boot the game that way. So you would have to have a conjunction of GSM, FreeMcBoot, and the HDMI mod to do that. HDMI alone wouldn't be able to do that, I'm pretty sure. The only other scenario in which you might be able to do that is like an optical drive emulator and an HDMI mod that talk to each other. So the very short answer to your question is No, it requires a deinterlacer, but because it's the PS2 and there's so much you could do with it, that's what required the longer answer for you. And that, if you just put an HDMI mod in a PS2, I'm 99.9% sure everything that's 480i will be deinterlaced. But if you combine it with software mods as well, not even necessarily a mod chip, but some kind of software mods, it should be at least plausible that somebody could work on an easier way to force progressive scan native modes. So I always say how I never delete comments here on Patreon, and if a comment goes missing, that it's a freak occurrence and I don't know why. This time I deleted a comment, and it was totally an accident. Louis Zezeran had a question about something, and I knew he was working on a video about it, which I think is the one I just watched on his channel, and I wanted to respond right away so he could get it right for his channel. And then after I hit respond, somehow I hit delete on his question, so my silly response looks like it's a question to myself. I don't know, but Lewis's question was, they'd like to lag test a flat panel with a time sleuth, and they'd like to compare the lag on the HDMI input to the lag on the composite input of the screen. They have one of the HDMI to component converters that I recommended, and they were asking how they could convert component to composite. They also have a good quality Extron S-Video to composite converter, if that helps. So there's two different answers to that. If the goal of this is just to test with a time sleuth, you might be able to, in many scenarios, take that same exact HDMI to component video converter, and then just take the green output, I believe it's the green, and plug it into composite video on your TV. And the colors won't be right, but that does not matter for just measuring lag. That won't have any impact on it whatsoever. It shouldn't have any impact on it whatsoever. And if you're using one of the zero lag DACs that I talked about, that also won't be a factor. So that's something I would try right away, because I always say those HDMI to component or HDMI to VGA converters are something that should be considered a tool in your toolbox. Maybe you use it every day, maybe you use it once a year, but for $20, if you're a tinkerer, not just somebody that sets up their setup and never touches it again, but if you're somebody that likes messing with stuff, you should really have one of those. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it, and the way that I've done it before, just to be ridiculous, is taking an HDMI to VGA converter, and then taking one of the VGA to either S-Video or composite video converters, and there's a few out there, and using that. And RGB, so via VGA to S-Video, works fine. As long as it's 240p or 480i, a 15 kilohertz signal. There are color issues going from RGB to composite that are still not quite solved yet. But once again, that wouldn't matter at all for just testing with a time sleuth. So the reason that I had used the more complicated version, which requires 2 more power supplies and, a bunch of wires, was that doing it that way, I'm able to test, HDMI, component video, composite video, and S-Video, all with those different adapters. But if your scenario is like Lewis's and you just need to test composite, component, and HDMI, just that one converter would work. So I'll leave a link to the DACs, and I'll leave a link to at least one of Lewis's videos. I saw one that he just did a lag test with it, but maybe there's going to be another one as well. So that's definitely the easiest answer just from a testing point of view, and a very cool thing to do. And I got to give a shout out to Shank for reminding me about that component video thing, because I'd done it a while back, and then once I got my own the converters that I just talked about, I always did it that way, and he was the one that reminded me, like, no, there's also an easy way to do this for composite. So I wanted to share that as well, and give the shout out. Also, Lewis said, P.S. now Bob lives in the country. Bears see Bob and think, damn, and I thought we were hairy. Yeah, but I'm cuter. Hector Santana said that I've mentioned many times that the RetroRGB site needs some work and updating, and they were wondering if there's any way for the community to help with that. They wanted to report broken links and out-of-date info, but they know I already have a ton to do. Is there a way I want everybody to report this kind of stuff? And also, in a related question, is the wiki going to replace the RetroRGB website besides the news blog section? So I have a couple of answers to that, but I got to start by thanking you for the offer. That's very nice that people are paying attention, and thank you for asking something like that. My answer to that's kind of complicated. First and foremost is I would recommend that once the wiki launches, which should be very soon, hopefully, one way or another, that people just start contributing to that right away, because that's one of those things where I want to make sure that in the beta period that it's launched, we get it to a point where once it's opened up for everybody, it's not a mess. Because one of the worst things that could happen to any product launch, whether it's a free open source wiki or whether it's like a product, is terrible things happen on launch day and people walk away going, oh, that's crap. You lose half your audience right away. So I want to make sure that the wiki's out there, because the goal for that really is to last forever. I really am trying to make it a not-for-profit, like an official accredited not-for-profit. I'm trying to make it so that the hosting is always paid for forever, that people could host whatever they want that's even remotely related to retro gaming hardware and software. So that's the one that I would definitely say start out with that. As far as RetroRGB.com goes, I do know there's a bug where sometimes links are broken because you need to add www to the front. I think there's still something broken on mobile browsing, and it's just a matter of time. And Justin from Console Kits has been the savior of RetroRGB backend, and I try to only really bother him when I can't fix it or when it's really important. So I don't want to waste that much more of his time that he's already put in a ridiculous amount of time. So hopefully we could figure out how to fix those things. But I want to, that's up to us to do, because RetroRGB is still technically closed. If you would like to contribute, reach out and, feel free to post your articles and join the team. But it's still kind of a closed group of people at the moment. So I don't want to ask everybody for their help on something that at the end of the day benefits me. A lot of people don't look at it that way, luckily, but, I don't want to ask for stuff like that yet. Now, to move forward with your question, to get on to the other kind of fun stuff, is the wiki going to replace the RetroRGB website besides the news blog section? So the goal is eventually, yes, mostly. So eventually, I would love to see every guide I have removed from RetroRGB.com, moved to wiki.retrorgb.com, and have it be a community effort. Because I found myself repeating a lot of stuff in that, there's 3 different types of SNES RGB mods to do, and the first 3 pages of each mod are the same. So I would love to have that cleaned up and have it say, start by disassembling your console with a link to how to disassemble an SNES, stuff like that. So kind of iFixit Wikipedia style. And I want to get all that stuff settled. Then I want to get the link forwarding done properly. And I want, while obviously everything we do is based in fact, an all about rule would be the wiki is just facts and RetroRGB is opinions mixed with facts. So the SNES section might be replaced with links to the wiki, general information, my favorite accessories for it that I would like to link to, and stuff like that. But generally speaking, going forward, reviews and opinions on RetroRGB mixed with facts, and obviously stuff like here's your new firmware update, new product launch, stuff like that, and just the facts on the wiki. So yeah, everything would kind of move over. And there is also talks of how to open up RetroRGB for more of a collaboration and try to further my agenda of not making me RetroRGB, but making sure that I'm completely separate and that people know that RetroRGB is a hub of information and not Bob's site. And it still very much is, but one way or another, I would like to continue to push away from that, not because of anything other than positivity. I want this to be known as a website and corresponding everything that celebrates stuff going on in the retro gaming scene. And I'm certainly not, that's not like a backhanded compliment to like retro gaming YouTubers or anything like that. It's the opposite. I love what they do and I want to support what everybody does, content creators, product developers, software developers, everything. And that's kind of where I'm pushing RetroRGB towards. And if there is a way to open it up to more people, that's when, yes, I would love to get not just 1 or 2, but 5 or 6 IT web developers, all in, like a private Discord, so that anytime something happens with the site, broken links, anything like that, we could have ways to submit broken anything. We could have a group of people going, I got 10 minutes to kill today, I'll fix it. So it all doesn't just fall on Justin and my shoulders. And by saying that, it's mostly Justin, because it's at the point where I can fix a lot of this stuff, but he's integrated so many cool things into the site that I don't want to fix one thing that breaks 4 others. So I'm usually running behind him, pulling on his coattails like, hey dude, want to help? So yeah, it's kind of a long answer, but I wanted to be clear about that because I just think of all of the things that the team has accomplished with such positivity that I want to make sure that I get that message out properly. And I didn't want to just be like, yeah, well, we'll get to RetroRGB eventually. Like, I wanted everybody who cared enough to listen to this to understand where we're going, and hopefully there will be very cool things happening in the next year, starting with the wiki, which could be essentially any day now. Still, we're working out details and how we're going to do this, what we're going to do, but it's at the final stages. Retro Music Dan has a question regarding the PS3 and Xbox 360. They're designing a new setup built around the RetroTINK 5X and a 4K TV. Is it advisable to use the component ounce on those newish old consoles into the TINK to scale them up? Or is this something to be avoided and to just go directly HDMI into the TV? Any particular reasons to do this or to avoid doing this? They often don't see much discussion around these consoles and their possible usage with scalers. So a few things. First and foremost, if you ever look to downscale, that's a perfect option for that. RetroTINK 5X could take the 480p, or I guess 720p, but set it to 480p output of those consoles and downscale it to 240p for use on any kind of PVM or consumer grade TV with component inputs or anything like that. Or I guess S-Video if you have one of those converters too. So that's the number one use most people I know have been using for those. The number two would be adding scan lines to 480p. And I've used this for experimenting with watching movies and TV. A lot of people have used this to put retro style games on their flat panel. So that's certainly a very good use case for these that I think many people might enjoy in some cases. Now, the last thing that I want to mention does come with the one caveat, the one particular reason not to do it, and that any time you have an analog signal being converted to digital, you're going to have some analog video noise. That's not a dig to the RetroTINK, that's not a dig to the OSSC or any other kind of analog to digital converter. It's just the way it is. So you might on your TV want to try doing something like 480p to 1440p, or I'm not sure if there's much 720p scaling, but there are some games on those consoles that would benefit from running them in a lower resolution because they're only rendered in those lower resolutions anyway. So you get a higher frame rate and then you let the RetroTINK scale it. I remember John Linneman from Digital Foundry a couple times said that he runs at least one game on the PS3 at 480p because you get such a higher frame rate. And then in that case, you would use the TINK to scale that to maybe even 1440p, and you would get a little bit of analog noise, especially since you're scaling such a relatively small resolution to a high resolution. But the benefit of scaling or adding that frame rate might be more than enough to push you to do so. There's also, of course, the side that the RetroTINK is designed to integer scale or nearest neighbor scale in most cases. So it might make it too sharp, but I generally think that when you're using 4K TVs, the smooth scaling that it does for the rest of it is actually pretty good. That was one of the things I loved about the DC Digital, in that just using the line doubling to 960p and then letting my TV scale that to 4K was a really great combination of sharp and soft scaling. So you're going to want to just try it. Would I use it that way all the time? That's really depends on the games you play. I would really start by experimenting with this. And I wouldn't tell anybody to go out and buy a RetroTINK 5X just to do this. But I would absolutely say if you already have a TINK 5X for your other consoles and you have a PS3 and a 360, try it. See what the games look like, see what your eyes prefer. Because a lot of times when you're talking about this stuff, the end result really is a combination of your eyes at the distance that you normally sit from your TV on your very specific TV and how all of these things come together. So you and I could run the exact same tests and have two completely different opinions on the result. So if you already have that stuff, give it a try and see. But there are no reasons not to do that other than maybe you'll get a little bit of analog noise or interference on the screen. There's no safety issues, there's no lag issues, none of that stuff. So I would definitely give it a try and see what happens. And hey, you never know, maybe you'll stumble across a really cool thing that you like that has a unique experience for some of those games. DW623 had a couple of questions regarding batteries, and the first is they were planning on installing cartridge battery slot holders inside all of their game cartridges. And for anybody that's unaware, all of the game carts that I've seen have batteries soldered in. So you could desolder that and reinstall one the same way, or you could add a slot so that when your battery dies the next time, 20 years from now or whatever, all you have to do is pop the battery out and pop a new one in without any soldering required. So DW623 said that should be pretty easy for consoles, but what about handhelds? And I don't think there's enough space in the handhelds to do that. You might want to check Voltar's videos on that stuff, but I'm pretty sure you have to install it pretty similar to the original. You might be able to do something like use a smaller battery and a smaller slot, but then you're not talking about 30 years of battery life. You might be talking about 10. So I don't know. That one's up to you, but I would do a little more research, but I don't think that would be an easy thing to do. Also, they wanted to know what do I think about best practice for rechargeable batteries. So now I believe you're talking about things like the Panasonic Eneloops or stuff like that. And DW623 says they charge them once a month so that they don't just die while sitting in a drawer. I personally just leave them in a drawer and use them whenever I need them, and I haven't had any issues yet. I have had a couple of Eneloops die over the years where when you're charging, the light starts to flash, and you could tell when you're using them, your device doesn't last as long, but I've never had any other issues. And as far as I know, with stuff like that, it's always best to discharge the batteries to as close to zero as possible before recharging them all the way up to 100. So I think, I could be wrong about this, and maybe it's a different story with Eneloops or whatever else, but I think it's best to just leave them in a drawer, and if they slowly fade over time, plugging them into whatever you have and draining them to zero would be better than letting them drop down to 60, charge it to 100, let it drop down to 60, charge to 100. But that battery technology's changed, so I don't really know if that's the right answer anymore. I'm just sharing what I do and kind of crossing my fingers and hoping it's the right advice. I always try to be honest about that. And lastly, they wanted to talk a bit about PSP batteries expanding. And, is this something that we have an issue with in other consoles? Is the reason that the battery is so easy to replace because Sony knew this was going to happen? And I don't really know. I certainly haven't seen that happen in anything other than laptops and PSPs. Maybe it's happened on other handhelds. Maybe it will happen on the Switch or something. But I've seen a ton of Chromebooks and the PSP all that have that happen. And I actually got into an argument with the Retro Game Store about this like 6 or 7 years ago. I don't think they're around anymore. It certainly wasn't one of the ones I always talk about. But they were selling all of these batteries. And then when I brought one back, they were like, no returns and, trade in value only or something. And I was like, no, this is dangerous. If this thing pops, you're selling danger to your customers. And they were dicks about it, but whatever. So yeah, it's definitely a problem. And I don't know more about it. And I also don't even know if there's a solution out there that, yes, buy model 123 replacement battery and that won't happen. So if anybody has any advice on PSP batteries or any inside info on that, please post in the comments. But I would just, with the PSP, I would make sure that, if you're storing it, to take the battery out. My friend Danielle always yells at everybody, take your batteries out of your controllers and out of your consoles. And she's right. I had a remote control that was like 3 years old. So nothing in the span of electronics. And I opened it up and the batteries were all oxidized and leaking. So excellent advice. unless you use something daily, so I wouldn't have found that remote anyway, but unless you use something daily, take the batteries out when you're not using it. If you're creative, find a way to place the batteries next to them so they're right there and you could just put them back in and keep using them. But definitely take them out, both for what if they expand, what if they leak, or just a million safe reasons to do that, just for longevity and protection. A couple of things from Gourd Captain. First, they ended up trying a cheap S-Video to S-Video cable, and it seemed to work fine, even though it was only $3. So they just wanted to share that experience. I would not take that risk if it was something that was very important to me. If I was in the situation of, hey, I just need this to work. If it works, cool. If it doesn't, or if there's interference, I'll buy a better one eventually. Then yeah, I would absolutely go and get a $3 cable, hope for the best. And if it was noisy, then whatever. I'll place an order for a better one and change it eventually. But generally speaking, the shielding around those very cheap cables are probably garbage, and any of the color information could bleed into the other stuff. So that's when you get those weird checkerboard patterns on it. But it's always context, right? If you're like, I'm building my setup, I don't want to tinker with it, I want the best, I want a nice clear picture, just get the shielded ones. But, like I said, on the flip side, if you're like, I need this to just work right now and I'll deal with quality later, yeah, buy whatever. There's certainly never a safety issue when using composite to composite or S-Video to S-Video or VGA to VGA or whatever. As long as it's not a cable with a circuit in it, you should never have to worry about safety, only just quality, video interference, hum on the audio side, stuff like that. Next is a question that I'm also curious about myself. Some games on the PS2, GameCube, and Wii use Dolby Pro Logic formats for surround sound, which go through a standard 2-cable analog audio signal. But their HDMI-based 5.1 setup doesn't understand this format, even when they run it through optical digital audio. Is there a way to convert that surround sound format to a digital format? And I have no clue, but I would really like to know the answer to that as well. The one question I did have for a friend of mine who is absolutely an expert, and this was a question I asked years ago, but do I have to find an old receiver to decode those formats? Is it something like, if you want to play a DVD, you could grab, a million devices, but if you want to grab a DVD player that has an excellent deinterlacer in it, you might have to go back and pick something up from something expensive from the early 2000s. And he said, no, that's not the case. It's one of those things where all of these formats and the ability to read them just gets basically metaphorically copied and pasted into all of the new stuff. But I asked that in the context of analog, not as digital. So if assuming his answer is correct, that means if you take I think Star Fox had Dolby Surround in it. So if you take those left and right cables and you plug them into a stereo's left and right basic RCA audio inputs, it should be able to decode those extra hidden sound channels and send them to your rear speakers. But I don't know what happens over digital. It might be as simple as sending some kind of flag down the HDMI line that says, hey, there's Dolby Pro Logic in here. And that, if that's the case, that should be a fixable issue. It would require another device, but that should be possible. Or it could come down to your receiver. You might have to manually enable it, and some do or don't. But I would love to know an answer to that. So if anybody has some solid info, and not just my educated guesses, I would certainly love to hear it. Pascal Kuhner had an interesting question, and I think I understand the question properly. If I get the question wrong, this answer is going to be way off, but I think the question is they want to have an event where they set up 10 original consoles, each with their own TFT monitor. And by TFT monitor, I'm assuming that means a flat panel monitor with a VGA input. Based on the context of the question, I think that's what they're going for. So if that's the right question, then I think I have the right answer for you. And the number one key here is each get their own monitor. Because if it was a situation where you had 10 consoles that you want to hook up to your one monitor, then that video that I did, connect classic consoles to VGA monitors, would be your answer. Pick whichever scaler fits your needs the best, and that's it. But the problem is, if you followed that video, you would have to have 10 scalers. So buying a RetroTINK Mini for $80 or whatever it is now is a very reasonable thing, but buying 10 of those now gets expensive. So I would say that, especially because you seem to be going into VGA, the number one solution for you would be those GBS control boards. You could just take them unmodded and use whatever you have input into that and hope that it works, but the lag is variable. It's not the greatest solution. And you could get 10 of those Wi-Fi modules, a bundle of 10 on eBay or Amazon for very, very cheap. So it would be a little time consuming because you'd have to mod each one of those GBS boards with the GBS control software, but it also would be very cost effective because if you're doing this all yourself, you might be able to do this for under $400 total for 10 scalers that do many different things, and they all output VGA, which would be great because that seems to be what you're going for. The only downside would be they would only accept RGB, VGA, and component. So if you had any consoles that were S-Video or S-Video or composite, you could use something like a Core-U transcoder, but then you'd have to buy one transcoder for each of those. So I would this might be the scenario in which I would say that RGB modding your consoles might be overall the most cost-effective thing to do, as opposed to buying, maybe you have 6 consoles that are already RGB or component, but 4 that are composite or S-Video, so you'd have to buy 4 Core-Us. Might actually be cheaper to just mod them yourselves and get RGB or component out of them. So I think I got your question right. Please correct me or reach out directly if I'm wrong, but it sounds like in your scenario, a bunch of GBS controls would be the best and most cost-effective solution, especially because they output VGA, and that's all you need anyway. You never need a digital solution on the outside of it. So hopefully I got that right. I'll leave a link to that Classic Consoles on VGA Monitors video, just in case anybody's interested, because it is kind of the same concept. The Remora is looking for a way to get their Dreamcast into component video. And of course, with the part shortages, the HD Retrovision cables, who knows when they'll eventually show up. So they're looking for a solution they could do right now. And I would suggest a very cheap VGA to component converter. I have hunted down ones for years, and it's really hard to find ones that work well, especially for gaming. Because Steve even tested a bunch with me years ago, and we found that a lot of them should be fine for video, but you could see some very obvious differences, especially if they're pointed out to you with video games. So we tested expensive ones. We tested a couple from the community. One was terrible. I did not get a chance to test the LinuxBot 3000 one, which I've heard is very good. So my suggestion to you would be decide on your price point. If you know this is going to be a temporary solution and you just want something that works, try one of those $10 adapters you find on Amazon or eBay and hope that they don't stink. But if you wanted something that should be a much better solution, if not, the perfect solution, check out LinuxBot 3000's eBay store and see if they have the VGA to component converter there, and that should be the better choice. And you're going to spend more, but I think this is one of those scenarios where you get what you pay for. I haven't personally put that on a scope and done a deep dive analysis, but I have tested a bunch of LinuxBot 3000's other stuff and loved it. So, this is one of those scenarios in which I'm biased because I've tested other stuff, so I'm just going to assume it's good. I might be wrong, but I'm comfortable giving the recommendation just based on experience with other products from the same person. So that would be my recommendation now, is just decide how important this conversion is to you. Do you want something solid that you could probably use on multiple things and still use after the Dreamcast HD Retrovision cables come out? Or do you just want a tool to throw in your toolbox that maybe you use once a year after you upgrade to the HDRs? So let price be the deciding factor, but I'm going to leave a link to LinuxBot 3000 store anyway, because I always love to support the community. Oliver Clare has a wide variety of consoles that they're currently using through a FrameMeister, and they'll eventually be switching to a RetroTINK 5X. But they want to start doing game capture and streaming as well, and they've never done that before, so they want to know if there's one capture card they could get that would work with everything, or would they need to get multiple capture cards to optimize their streaming setup. There's good news, and there's an easy answer, and then a slightly more complicated answer. The good news is that if you're using the FrameMeister and you're using the RetroTINK 5X and triple buffer mode, any capture card should work. The only factors that you would want to have to deal with are what resolution and frame rate it could accept. Because there's tons of cheap cards out there that could accept 720p 60, but cap out 1080p at 30. So you would basically just need to get any card that could accept 1080p 60, and in my opinion, that would be all that you need. So you don't need to spend a lot of money. Compatibility should be 100%, and you don't have anything to worry about. Except if you switch the RetroTINK 5X to frame lock mode, so it's the zero latency mode, there are capture cards that are more compatible than others. In your scenario, I wouldn't worry about it, because if you're already used to gaming on the FrameMeister and the lag doesn't bother you, the RetroTINK 5X in triple buffer mode is actually less than that. So even in its higher lag mode, and I say that jokingly because it's not actually high lag, but in its higher lag mode, it's still faster than what you're used to, and it should have compatibility be at, if not 100%, damn near it, because it should be sending a perfectly compliant signal no matter what capture, or no matter what console you're inputting to it. So that would be the only thing that I would suggest. If for whatever reason you're getting pretty obsessed with lag, and you want to make sure that you're doing speed runs and stuff like that, then you could look into getting something like a DataPath Vision capture card, which should be compatible. In fact, in my testing, it's been compatible with the RetroTINK 5X in frame lock, zero lag, or near zero lag mode with everything I've tested. There's a few others out there. There's some modern ones, but that really gets down the road of how important is capture and streaming to you, and are you a speedrunner? So it would be also my opinion that if you were a speedrunner, you'd want to pick up any CRT, split the signal coming out of your console, and send what you're looking at to the CRT, and then send everything else to the capture card, so lag wouldn't matter at all, even for a speedrunner, because on your CRT, everything is going to be zero lag. So I didn't want to just give you the short answer, because I feel like there's other people listening to this that might have a similar question, but they are a speedrunner. So to answer you directly, Oliver, I don't think you have anything to worry about. Get a 1080p 60 compatible capture card. Get the cheapest one you could find that's the easiest to install, whether it's USB, Thunderbolt, or internal. And I don't think you'll have any issues whatsoever. Just set your RetroTINK to frame lock mode. If you have any issues, switch it to triple buffer and you're done. If there's speedrunners out there, I still strongly recommend going through a CRT and then using any solution. Heck, use those garbage SCART to HDMI solutions for the streaming side. If you're only using them to stream, awesome, great. You have a fairly sharp solution that you have no worries about, that's super cheap. But make sure that you split your solution, or you split your output of your console, so that you're gaming on a zero lag total solution, and then whatever goes to the capture card doesn't really matter other than for archival purposes. Oliver has one more question that I'm honestly not sure of the answer to. They're looking into buying a modded Mega Drive that's been listed as switchless, region free. So you could either hold the reset button or a control pad combo to change the region. And they'd like to know, is a mod like this going to change the speed in which the console runs, or is it just going to make it compatible? And I don't know, and I don't have a lot of experience with that. What I do have experience with is running Japanese consoles, US games on Japanese consoles, or vice versa, which are all 60 hertz, so that's kind of easy. And also anything with ROM carts. So I put a ROM cart into a Mega Drive, launch a US game, and that US game on a PAL console is going to run at 50 hertz. So I would assume that there's probably both types of mods floating around, and I would just double check that very specific mod has a way to change speed, as well as just disable the encryption and allow a ROM to run. Also, whenever you're buying something pre-modded, you're going to want to see pictures of the work. And in fact, every time I've seen people sell stuff, whether it's eBay or privately, when they do a great job, you don't need to ask. The pictures are there. Hey, modded Genesis, switchless mod. Here's what I did. Here's close-ups of the pictures. A lot of people even put a note like, if you're unfamiliar with modding, please understand that these are close-ups. So things that might not look perfect are that way because you're zooming in 1,000 times, your normal sight, which is totally fair. But if there's already pictures up and if people are proud to show their work, it's usually a better experience than people who like huff and puff when you ask them for proof that the mod was done right. So that's the only advice I can give, is just make sure it's done right and then just ask directly, does it change the speed of the console or is it just an unlock to allow you to play the games that way? And if anybody has any info on like the latest Genesis region free mods, please let me know, because I know I've been wanting to do a write-up on that, but I just never have the time, and I'm never quite sure of what's the current go-to standard for that. Jason Guffey said, we see a lot of awesome homebrew games for consoles like NES, SNES, and Mega Drive, but it seems to stop there. Obviously, it's a lot more complex to make games for 32 and 64-bit systems like PS1 and N64, but do you think we'll get to a point where people are putting out new games for these systems? And if so, when? They'd love to see what a 2D Metroidvania could look like using everything the N64 could muster. Metroid 64. So I'm not a software developer, so what I'm about to say is basically a general statement that I don't truly understand, but I think a lot of this stuff relies on development tools. So in the case of, a lot of these other consoles, development tools have been leaked on the internet for years, and new homebrew solutions have been made. I've seen game editors released for like Super Metroid, for Sonic, for the SMS, one I keep meaning to do a write-up on the site about, but those are tools that people create that allow other people to step in and make a brand new game based on an existing game's engine, or sometimes even a brand new game from scratch. And the more tools that are available, the more of a chance of people doing so. Now, I've seen quite a few N64 ROM hacks where it's not just like enabling unlocked content, it's a completely different game based on the engine of the original. So you can check the Crix forums. They have lists of cool mods like that. So I think it really is interest and tools. You need the interest to do it, and you need to have the tools available to get it done. And that's why you see a lot of things like a lot of the homebrew on the Jaguar either just uses the basic processor that's in there that's supposed to be for I/O control, which is why you see so many terrible looking homebrew Jaguar games. And hey, people get really upset at me when I say that, but it's the truth. If you're on the Atari Jaguar playing something that looks like it could be on an 8-bit system, it doesn't mean that it's a bad game. It just means it doesn't look like it should be on the Jaguar. Where on the flip side of it, all of the people that are using the Tom and Jerry chips, I always get that and the one from the 3DO confused, but people that develop on those chips takes a lot longer because they have to write a lot of their own software, and they're kind of just going through and doing their best to make things happen with what they have. So that's why you don't see as many on some of the rarer consoles, because the tools aren't available and it's a lot of work to do that. Next question, since the N64 has been on their mind lately, why do you think there weren't many 2D games for the system? It's the chip. The Silicon Graphics chip was designed specifically for 3D graphics. So if I'm remembering this right, the N64 wouldn't have been able to do a bunch of 2D stuff. And I think that's why I believe Yoshi's Story, it was technically a 2D game, but I think it was rendered in a way that seemed more like 3D graphics. I'm kind of talking out of turn here, but that's definitely what I remember reading and hearing people talk about. Who knows if that's just internet myth that's been repeated over the years that now I'm accidentally spreading misinformation, but I think that's it. I think the chip that was built in there was really designed for 3D, not 2D. And I think that might also be why you didn't see a bunch of arcade ports on it, because it couldn't really be done with that hardware. Which I guess gets to the last part of your question, mostly wondering why third parties didn't throw low-effort 2D games out for it. I think it pretty much wouldn't have worked. I think it wouldn't have worked as well as Super Nintendo at the time, and that's why they didn't do it. So once again, I like to be very clear with what's my opinion, what's a fact, and what I think is a fact, and this is the third one. I think I'm remembering this correctly, but I could very well have just been word vomiting out the total wrong answer, and my apologies if that's the case. One more from Lewis. He said that in my video on the Time Sleuth, I said I hadn't personally come across any screens which didn't work with the Time Sleuth. It seems they have a Sony LCD at home which stubbornly refuses to play with the device. They've tested it over HDMI and composite with the same result. The Time Sleuth works correctly with other screens. Have I heard anything about this or any tips on settings or changes which might help? Brightness. So that would be the first thing I would recommend, is turn the brightness all the way up and see if that helps. And, any crazy outside influences. If you're in a sunny room, it should be fine. But if you're in a sunny room with direct sunlight beaming right on the screen, I'm assuming, I know you well enough, you didn't do that. But for anybody listening, those would be the first things that I would suggest. Make sure no crazy outside influence, turn the brightness all the way up, and kind of go from there. But since that video, I have not personally come across screens that didn't work, but I have talked to a few people who it didn't work at all, and I have gotten one or two measurements that aren't exactly perfectly accurate. And when I say that, rest assured that I'm talking about within 2 or 3 milliseconds max. And to be clear, milliseconds, not frames. It's not off by 3 frames. 2 or 3 milliseconds on some panels in some situations. I remember speaking to Dan and Christoph about that, and they said that they would have to build the device a totally different way to have true 100% compatibility, and to make sure that even in those rare scenarios which the measurement was off, it could be more accurate. And also, just a note, it always registered as more, not less. So there's never been a case where I've held the Time Sleuth up to something and went, oh, cool, this is low lag, and it turns out to be lots of lag. It's the opposite. I held the Time Sleuth up and I go, oh, there's only 3 milliseconds of lag in the top left corner. What an awesome monitor. Turns out there's only 1 millisecond of lag, but it's the complete dark to complete bright, and the way that goes. So all good news about the Time Sleuth, except the scenarios in which they don't work at all, which isn't common. And hopefully Dan and Christoph might consider a follow-up product with even more features, because you could dial in 5 resolutions, but it'd be really neat if you could if there was like a mini touchscreen and you punch in whatever resolution you want. You could send aspect ratio controls, so you're deliberately sending 4:3 or 16:9. I know Shank would certainly love a color pattern tester as well on there. There's a lot of stuff you could do, and you could do that with a Raspberry Pi now, but it's a mess. It's a solution where you gotta like tape stuff to your TV to get the lag reading, and then there's ways to do it, but it would be very cool if, when the team had time, PixelFX released Time Sleuth Pro with a million different options in it, and at a very high price, and priced so that only the freaks like us would buy it, and everybody else could just buy the regular Time Sleuth and have at it. But it was kind of a longer answer than you were probably looking for, but I wanted to be clear about that, because the Time Sleuth is still awesome, and when it's not accurate, it's not accurate in the way that we would all prefer it to be. Only a few milliseconds and a slightly higher reading, so you never accidentally use a laggy monitor. But yeah, it would be kind of cool if there was a different one that had pro use cases. Also, I just thought it was absolutely hilarious that I was done shooting the Q&As, and I always hit refresh on all of the pages to make sure I didn't miss any questions or if anything came in, and I hit refresh, and apparently Lewis asked this question like the moment I hit refresh, because it said 1 minute when I started recording the answer to it. So that's pretty funny, but you snuck it in under the wire, Lewis. Yeah, so any questions on the Time Sleuth, I'll leave a link to that. Well, that's it for this week. If you're new to these Q&As, please post any question you have wherever it is that you support in the latest Q&A post. The way these services work, I can't figure out what's a new question on an older post, and I really just like scrolling through in real time and answering them like this. So any question at all, just ask wherever you post in the newest post. And if for whatever reason I don't get to it or I miss it, it's always an accident. Maybe I manually deleted it by accident like I did to Lewis this week, or more likely something was up with any of the support services, or I accidentally deleted the file in post and didn't notice. That hasn't happened a lot lately, because That is one of the benefits of keeping the timestamps, because I could reference a timestamp that I wrote down, and if the file isn't there, then I know I missed it, but it does still happen on occasion. So my apologies. If I miss a question, message me or just ask next week. But anyway, as always, thank you to everybody who participates in these, and especially thank you to anybody who supports in any way, including just spreading the word, because a lot of times it really is, when it comes to support services, about quantity. So even if you're not in a position to support, please spread the word, because your support is keeping everything related to RetroRGB going, and without it, pretty much all of it would go away. So thank you very much for all of that, and I'll see you next week.